session I'm going to talk about today is Richard Hell's Destiny Street, which was his second album that I remixed a couple years ago with Nick Zinner of the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and Richard Hell. Richard had recorded this album in 81 or 82, and he admittedly said he was very checked out during the whole process and never liked how it turned out, how the mixes turned out specifically. In the early 2000s, Richard found, he didn't have the original tapes, but he found mix downs of the drums, the bass, rhythm guitar. So he decided, I'm going to try to remake this album from that by adding on lead guitar and vocals. So he did that in about 2009. And then it wasn't until 2019 that an engineer actually found 3 of the 4 original tapes containing most of what was on the original album, all 24 tracks. So Richard had the idea, like, now I can finally do this for real. However, we were still missing one of the tapes. So the challenge was marrying these generations of recordings of this album from the early 80s, right? So it's kind of like sonically traveling through time and trying to solve all these issues. We had the 24 tracks for, a number of the songs, great. But for the 3 or 4 that were missing the 24 tracks, we had backing tracks and we had the re-recorded vocals and lead guitar. But Richard wanted it to sound like a cohesive new version of this album. So the challenge was making those tracks where we had to have the mixed down versions of the rhythm section with added on lead guitar and vocals sound like now we have all the options available to us because I have all 24 tracks available. The purpose of these backing tracks when they were bounced down or printed down in 1981 was so that Richard could listen to them on his way home and think about lead guitar parts and vocal parts that he wanted to do. So it wasn't done with a lot of intention in terms of levels, in terms of making sure the snare was hitting with enough power and the kick drum was really, slamming. And this is 2019 now, right? So we're used to hearing more depth when it comes to especially like a drum kit than we were in the early 80s. So I had to figure out a way to create a multi-track drum kit from a stereo print of drums, bass, and electric guitar. So the way that we did this initially was we used Isotope's Rebalance, where you can analyze different aspects of music and solo as much as humanly possible a specific element. So we were able to solo, so to speak, the drum part enough that we could get the transients in there, right? So that I could have what sounded like a bit of an anemic drum kit, but it was the drum part, everything was present and accounted for, and everything else that was in that mix down was gotten rid of. But then the issue was, how do I make this sound like a really good drum kit, right? So we used Trigger to add in samples that matched close enough with the 24 tracks that we had available to us on the other sessions. So I made samples out of a lot of the drum kit used on the other songs. So for instance, taking some of the drums from Destiny Street and putting it on the song Lowest Common Denominator so that we could approximate the sound of that drum kit. Then combining that rebalanced track with the samples, running it through a dangerous submixer, which added a little bit of grit and beef to it. We were able to get it to sound a lot closer to what the other tracks were sounding like. And then we had the new lead guitar parts that were played. By this time, Richard Hell's original guitarists had unfortunately passed. So we had Mark Ribot and Bill Frisell had played the new lead parts on the 2000s version of this album. So we had those to work with, and those were on their own, and we were able to make that so they sounded like they were bringing in the qualities of the 1980s tracks, right? So again, we're traveling through sonic time with all of this and matching sounds and respecting the sound and the grit and the like punk rock of the original recordings. So here's what that original backing track, the mix down that we had, sounded like. it's not bad, you know, but it wasn't quite where the other tracks were at. We waited till the end to approach these because we wanted to see where we landed when we had all of our capabilities with all 24 tracks. So it wasn't bad, but again, we wanted to have more control over the sound of the drum kit, more control over the differences in levels, more control over the dynamics of the tracks. So for instance, on the snare, the snare's got a little bit more bite and tone to it. And again, I just borrowed one of the snares from the other track, so it is true to the original. I'm not taking samples from anywhere. I'm creating these samples from the original 80s drum kit and shaping them and beefing them up and sculpting them the way that we wanted it to sound in 2019. So those were added in underneath that stereo mix down. And for our kick drum, we're just adding in what we're missing, which is a bit of the knock. So it allows us to maintain that power throughout the track. And we can listen to that backing track. And then adding in that kick and snare sample. It's really in those transients we're really hearing them hit and pop a little bit more and stand out, so we have a little bit more control over how the drum kit is presenting itself, and it sounds fuller and tighter and has more energy. So then we were able to build up from there, add in our guitars, which we had recorded separately in the early 2000s. Here's a bit of Rabeau's guitar. And Richard was really insistent on everything staying true to the original in terms of where everything was spatially. That was really, really important to him, which was interesting. He wanted to be able to identify and understand which guitarist was on which side so that the listener could really hear Rabeau's playing, or in the earlier stuff, Naouch's playing or Quine's playing, right? He wanted to respect all the guitarists that have been a part of the Richard Hell legacy. We did play around with new effects. I used a lot of Eventide's T-Verb and Ultraverb, which I love to use both of those, and Little Altar Boy. Again, effects that were true to that time, but with a little bit of a modernized take on it. So here's a bit of our backing vocals.
Lowest dominator, lowest dominator, lowest dominator.
I used a lot of tape emulators as well to get that analog sound on the stuff that was recorded in the 2000s because it sounded newer than the originals, right? And I wanted everything to be cohesive. And then lastly we have Richard.
Wearing any face to help you get what you want and laughing at the ones you pull in. You think you're tricking in, you're only sickening. You'll never fool me again.
So it's cool. I mean, it's still Richard Hell, you know, and again, there's not too much you have to do. But there was, level control, adding some tasteful compression, using a lot of compressors that would have been used, just the plug-in version. So LA2As, using a lot of Studer emulators to get that sound of the original tape going. As I was trying to identify what was missing, what we were able to achieve in Destiny Street, for instance, where we had all 24 tracks versus what was missing from Lowest Common Dominator, where we did not have all 24 tracks. And this was no small task. This was a very emotional process for Richard too, because again, he really felt like he let himself down and let his band down in the 80s. So this was his, I believe, third attempt to release this record in a way that made him feel proud. And he ended up being very proud of this work. So it was, a real real honor, and that's the goal as an engineer or a producer, right? To allow the music to sound like what the artist was imagining in their head, but just weren't able to achieve. So again, the challenges we faced on Destiny Street Remix, which is the version that my mixes with Nick and Richard appear on, are marrying these different generations of this album, right? So the original 80s version, the 2000s version, and the 2019 version. And dealing with the big issue of 3 of the 4 tapes were found, but this mysterious 4th tape, I still think it's going to turn up one day, right? And then we'll get to dig into it, but making it sound like a cohesive album as if it was mixed right the first time. And I think that's the way that you remix a classic old record, or a record that people have a lot of respect for, an artist that people have a lot of reverence for, is you respect the original, but you use the tools available to you today to make possible what was never possible before. So I got my Odyssey Classics in 2017, and they just changed the game for me. I thought that nothing better than these could exist until I got the MX4s. And the main difference I hear between the two of these is it's almost like a souped up version of my classics. The one issue I would run into on my classics was with low end. Sometimes it was underrepresenting what was there. When I switched over to the MX4s, I'm not compromising any of the low end power. I'm hearing as though I am immersed within a space listening to the music. Again, I love the opportunity and the ability to use headphones, but I do not want to feel like I'm listening to headphones, and I do not want to feel like there is this distance between me and the music, which is why I really enjoy and at times prefer mixing on headphones nowadays, because there's no sort of separation between me and the song. I'm able to hear detail and clarity and really have an understanding of what's going on spatially. I truly don't think I would have survived 2020 career-wise without them. I don't know what I would do in terms of my workflow without them. They are an absolutely vital part of my everyday, and I do not go anywhere without them. I walk into a studio, I listen to their monitors, I put on my Odysseys and hear what's really happening, and I'm constantly switching between the two. These are just, for me, perfection in a pair of headphones, and I wouldn't change anything about them, but maybe in a couple years you all will blow me away again.